Welcome to the Sleepy Scholar, where curious minds drift off to fascinating facts and the world's greatest mysteries. Tonight, we'll journey into one of the most secretive places on Earth, Area 51, a place shrouded in secrecy, fueled by speculation, and surrounded by decades of unanswered questions. So settle in, relax, and let your curiosity wander. Like and share for more facts and mysteries around the world to fall asleep to. This is the Sleepy Scholar. Close your eyes, if they aren't already closing on their own. Somewhere in the Nevada desert, past 100 miles of empty highway, there's a stretch of dry lakebed surrounded by mountains, a fence, and a great deal of silence. For decades, the government wouldn't even confirm it had a name. Tonight, we're going to walk up to that fence together, slowly, and spend some time with 100 small mysteries. Some of them long since solved, some still genuinely open. About how one remote airstrip became one of the most famous places on Earth that almost nobody has actually seen. Let's start with where it actually is and how it began. The site now known worldwide as Area 51 sits at a place called Groom Lake, part of a larger military reserve called the Nevada Test and Training Range, roughly 83 miles north of Las Vegas. It was selected in 1955 by the Central Intelligence Agency, specifically as a secure testing site for a new aircraft, a high-altitude reconnaissance plane called the U-2. The dry lakebed offered a natural, ready-made runway, and the surrounding mountains offered something just as valuable to the people building it: near total isolation from prying eyes. For nearly 60 years afterward, the government's official position on the site's very name was silence. It wasn't until 2013 that the CIA formally acknowledged the existence of Area 51 by that name, through documents released following a Freedom of Information Act request filed by George Washington University's National Security Archive. 6 decades of a name everyone already knew, and an agency that simply quietly declined to say it out loud until the paperwork finally required them to. A great deal of what made this place famous actually has a fairly grounded explanation, once you know the timeline. Throughout the Cold War, Groom Lake was used to test a series of extraordinary aircraft. First the U-2, then later the A-12 and its more famous successor, the State Route 71 Blackbird, planes capable of flying faster and higher than almost anything the public had ever seen or heard of. Commercial pilots, radar operators, and ordinary civilians who spotted these aircraft in the sky, often catching glancing views of a shape and speed with no obvious explanation, frequently reported them using the only language available to them at the time: unidentified flying objects. A significant portion of the era's classic UFO sightings in the region, researchers and historians generally agree, can be traced directly back to exactly this. Genuinely mysterious to witnesses at the time, and genuinely explainable decades later, once the aircraft themselves were finally declassified. It's worth clearing up a connection that popular culture often draws a little too tightly. The famous Roswell incident, involving debris recovered near Roswell, New Mexico, occurred in 1947, a full 8 years before Area 51 was even established. The two are frequently linked together in popular imagination, but they aren't officially connected in the historical record. Air Force investigations conducted in 1994 and 1997 concluded that the Roswell debris most likely originated from a classified program called Project Mogul, a high-altitude balloon system designed to detect Soviet nuclear tests, rather than from anything associated with the Groom Lake facility at all. Some threads that feel connected, from a distance, turn out to simply be two separate stories, told close enough together in time that they eventually grew tangled. Much of the site's modern reputation traces back to one particular moment in 1989, when a man named Bob Lazar appeared in a televised interview claiming he had worked at a facility near Area 51, reverse engineering an extraterrestrial spacecraft. It's important to say plainly here, his claims have never been independently verified, and significant discrepancies have since been found regarding his stated academic credentials and employment history. What can be said with certainty is simply this: that interview dramatically reshaped the site's public mythology almost overnight, transforming a little-known Cold War testing ground into a household name synonymous with extraterrestrial secrecy. The government's handling of the surrounding land has its own genuinely well-documented, if less dramatic, story. Beginning in the 1950s and continuing for decades, authorities quietly withdrew large sections of public land around the site from ordinary Bureau of Land Management use, without immediately explaining why. Decades later, in the 1990s, a legal case brought by former contractors alleging exposure to toxic waste at the facility became one of the key events that ultimately forced greater public acknowledgement of the base's existence, as government lawyers navigated exactly how much they could discuss about a site they had never technically confirmed at all. This particular fence has been carefully guarded for a long time, in ways both dramatic and remarkably mundane. Over the decades, the site has collected a small handful of nicknames beyond its most famous one: Dreamland, Watertown, and simply the Ranch among them, names that emerged from internal military naming conventions and decades of outside speculation layering on top of each other. A single stretch of desert, given nearly as many names as it has had decades of secrecy. A much more recent chapter closes out this first walk along the fence. In the summer of 2019, a joking Facebook event titled Storm Area 51, "They Can't Stop All of Us," went viral, proposing, mostly as satire, that internet users gather en masse to run toward the base. Over 2 million people marked interest in attending online. In reality, no mass storming ever took place. Instead, small, good-natured festivals sprang up in nearby towns, drawing a modest but genuine crowd of curious visitors. It remains a striking, very modern reminder that whatever this place actually holds, the fascination surrounding it hasn't faded in the slightest, even now, over 60 years after it was first quietly built. The fence is still standing out there in the dark, exactly as it has for decades, whether anyone is watching it tonight or not. Let's walk a little further along that fence now. Some of what surrounds this place turns out to be stranger, in its own quiet, bureaucratic way, than any of the legends. For decades, a great deal of what happened at Groom Lake was funded through something called the Black Budget, a real, documented category of federal defense spending that isn't publicly itemized in detail, even to most members of Congress. It isn't a conspiracy theory. It's an actual, acknowledged mechanism within the federal budgeting process, and it's a significant part of why a facility this large could operate for so long without a clear paper trail leading back to it. The mystery here was never really about whether the money existed. It was only ever about where, exactly, it was quietly going. One of the specific programs run at the site had a name almost too fitting to invent: Oxcart, the CIA's internal code name for developing the A-12 reconnaissance aircraft throughout the early 1960s, the same program that would later lead to the more famous State Route 71 Blackbird. Declassified decades later, it remains one of the clearest, most concrete pieces of the site's real, documented history. A genuine secret, with a genuinely strange name, that turned out to be exactly what it always was: an aircraft development program, and nothing stranger than that. Nevada's state government eventually decided to lean into the area's reputation rather than fight it. In 1996, state officials officially renamed a stretch of State Route 375 the Extraterrestrial Highway, embracing the region's UFO mythology as a genuine tourism draw. It's a small, telling detail about how thoroughly the legend eventually outgrew the secrecy that first created it. Official road signs, put up by the same kind of government that once wouldn't say the base's name out loud at all. There's a broader piece of UFO folklore worth knowing about here too, even though it isn't specific to this one location. Since the 1950s, various witnesses to unusual sightings have reported being visited afterward by mysterious, unsettling figures, often described as wearing plain black suits, who allegedly pressured them into silence. These accounts, sometimes called the Men in Black phenomenon, trace back to early claims made by a man named Albert Bender in the 1950s, and the stories have never been independently substantiated by any verified evidence. It's worth holding on to both halves of that sentence equally: a real, documented cultural legend, and so far, nothing beyond personal testimony to confirm it actually happened as described. Here's something genuinely verifiable, hiding in plain sight at a very ordinary airport. Every working day, a fleet of unmarked commercial-style aircraft, widely nicknamed Janet Airlines, though never officially labeled that by any agency, transports employees from a dedicated terminal at Las Vegas's airport out to Groom Lake and other nearby facilities. The planes are real. The flights are real. The terminal is real and has been photographed extensively from public land nearby. What remains genuinely unclear, even now, is simply how many people fly on them, and exactly what each of them does once they land. The perimeter itself is patrolled by private security contractors, commonly nicknamed camo dudes by locals and enthusiasts who've spent time along the boundary roads. These contractors are documented to operate under real legal authority, permitting them to detain, and in some circumstances use force against, anyone who trespasses onto the restricted land. A genuine, verifiable arrangement, however unusual it might sound described aloud in the dark like this. Anyone who has driven the public roads near the site has likely seen the warning signs themselves, and they're worth describing plainly, since they're a matter of public record rather than rumor. The boundary is lined with ground sensors and clearly posted notices stating that deadly force is authorized against anyone who crosses onto the restricted land beyond them. It remains one of the very few places in the entire country marked this explicitly, this openly, without any accompanying explanation of what precisely is being protected quite so seriously. One more piece of real, documented legal history before we close this segment. Beginning with President Bill Clinton in 1995 and continued by every president since, the White House has signed an annual exemption declaring the site exempt from certain federal environmental disclosure laws. Laws that would otherwise require public reporting on hazardous waste handling. It's a genuine, ongoing legal mechanism, renewed year after year, quietly quiet in its own right, shielding at least some of the site's activities from the kind of public environmental scrutiny most federal facilities are required to undergo. And finally, a much lighter thread to end on. By the time films like Independence Day arrived in theaters in 1996, depicting Area 51 as the secret hiding place of a captured alien spacecraft, the mythology had become so widespread that it no longer needed introducing to audiences at all. It's worth remembering, gently, that stories like this reflect the legend rather than confirm it. Hollywood didn't uncover a secret. It simply borrowed one that the culture had already spent decades quietly building, one rumor, one nickname, one unmarked flight at a time. The fence is still out there, still marked exactly the way it's always been marked, whether the story around it ever gets fully resolved or not. Let's step back from the fence itself for a little while, and spend some time with the ground it's actually standing on. The dry lakebed the base sits on is a genuine, ancient geological feature called a playa, a flat, cracked, mineral-crusted basin left behind by a body of water that dried up long ago. It's part of why the location was chosen in the first place. A playa this size and this flat offers a naturally hard, wide, ready-made surface, ideal for testing experimental aircraft that might not always land gracefully. Before it held a single secret, it simply held water, thousands of years ago, and then, eventually, nothing at all. The wider region surrounding the site has picked up its own nickname over the years. Some call it the Nevada Triangle, a stretch of mountainous, high-altitude terrain where a striking number of small aircraft have crashed or vanished over the decades. Enthusiasts have occasionally attributed the pattern to something stranger than geography. The more grounded explanation, well documented by aviation investigators, points to exactly what you'd expect from the terrain itself. Sudden altitude changes, unpredictable mountain weather, and thin, difficult air, the same combination that makes mountainous flying genuinely hazardous almost anywhere in the world. Some of the most concrete escalations in the site's secrecy came directly in response to public curiosity, rather than in spite of it. In the early 1990s, a researcher named Glenn Campbell began mapping and publishing detailed guides to public vantage points overlooking the base, including two nearby peaks called White Sides and Freedom Ridge, where curious visitors could legally observe activity at Groom Lake from a distance. In 1995, the government specifically moved to withdraw and restrict public access to those exact mountain viewpoints, closing off the very locations that had made the site observable at all. It remains one of the clearest, most literal examples in this entire story of secrecy expanding directly in response to a specific, documented breach of it. There's an ongoing modern movement worth knowing about too, even though it extends well beyond this one location. Since the early 2000s, various individuals, some claiming past military or government backgrounds, have publicly called for what they describe as full government disclosure regarding UFOs, including efforts like the Disclosure Project, founded by Stephen Greer in 2001. It's worth being clear about where things actually stand. These claims have not been substantiated by mainstream scientific consensus and remain, so far, exactly that, claims made publicly, awaiting the kind of verifiable evidence that would move them into confirmed history. Something genuinely significant did happen more recently, though, and it's thoroughly documented. In December of 2017, the New York Times reported on a real, previously secret Pentagon initiative called the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, which had spent years studying military reports of unidentified aerial phenomena. Unlike a great deal of what we've discussed tonight, this program's existence has been officially confirmed by the government itself, along with several previously classified videos captured by military aircraft. It represents one of the rare moments where genuine, documented government secrecy and the broader UFO conversation actually verifiably intersected. That thread has continued directly into the present day. In the years since, Congress has passed legislation specifically requiring the Pentagon to report regularly on unidentified aerial phenomena, and in 2022, the Department of Defense formally established a new office, called the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, dedicated specifically to investigating these reports. Whatever your own view on what any of it ultimately means, this particular piece isn't speculation. It's current, ongoing, publicly confirmed government policy, still actively unfolding. Groom Lake's real, documented history includes more than the aircraft we discussed earlier, too. Declassified records confirm the site also played a role in early testing of stealth aircraft technology, including the F-117 Nighthawk, which made its first test flight there in 1981. Another genuinely confirmed chapter in a long, quiet history of exactly the kind of secretive aircraft development the site was originally built for in the first place. The base sits close to what was once called the Nevada Test Site, now known as the Nevada National Security Site, where the United States conducted extensive nuclear weapons testing for decades throughout the Cold War. Its proximity to this history is entirely real and well documented, and it may partly explain why some visitors to the region have reported unusual readings or lingering questions about the surrounding land over the years. Two significant, deeply secretive chapters of American history, built only a short distance apart from each other in the same quiet stretch of desert. And finally, something worth knowing about how visible this place has actually become, almost in spite of itself. Since commercial satellite imagery services became publicly available in the 2000s, anyone with an internet connection has been able to view the outlines of the base's runways and structures for themselves, for the first time in the site's history, without ever needing to approach the fence at all. A secret that spent 60 years guarded by mountains and warning signs, now visible, in outline at least, from almost anywhere in the world. The ground remembers all of it, the water that was there first, and everything built on top of it since. We spoke earlier about Bob Lazar's unverified 1989 claims, but one particular detail from his account is worth sitting with a little longer, because it's genuinely more complicated than it first appears. Lazar claimed the propulsion system he allegedly worked on was powered by a stable isotope of a then-undiscovered element 115. Remarkably, scientists did later synthesize element 115 in a laboratory in 2003, and it was officially confirmed and named Moscovium in 2016. But the real laboratory-created version is intensely radioactive and unstable, decaying in a tiny fraction of a second, nothing at all like the stable, usable material Lazar described. Supporters point to the coincidence as vindication. Skeptics point out the element's existence had already been theoretically predicted by physicists well before Lazar's claims, meaning it wouldn't have required any secret knowledge to reference it at all. Both readings remain genuinely available. The evidence simply hasn't settled the matter either way. Lazar also specifically claimed he worked not at Area 51 itself, but at a separate, smaller facility he referred to as S4, allegedly located near a nearby dry lakebed called Papoose Lake. Like the rest of his account, S4's existence in the form he described has never been independently confirmed by any outside source. It's worth understanding, gently, why so many people find claims like these easy to entertain in the first place. And there's real historical context behind that instinct. In 2007, the CIA declassified a set of internal documents that came to be known as the Family Jewels, detailing a range of past covert domestic activities the agency had conducted decades earlier, well outside its intended authority. And throughout the 1950s, 60s, and into the early 70s, the CIA ran a real, extensively documented program called MKUltra, involving covert experiments on unwitting human subjects, testing the effects of various drugs and psychological manipulation techniques. These aren't rumors or theories. They're confirmed, declassified history. Genuine evidence that government secrecy has, at times, hidden things every bit as unsettling as anything fiction has ever imagined. It's part of why healthy public skepticism toward official explanations isn't unreasonable on its face, even when any one particular claim, like Lazar's, remains unproven. Here's a small, fascinating historical detail worth knowing, straight from the official record rather than any outside theory. On July 8, 1947, the Public Affairs Office at the Roswell Army Airfield issued its own press release, stating plainly that the military had recovered a flying disc. It was retracted the very next day, replaced with the now famous weather balloon explanation. It's a genuinely remarkable detail. The words that launched decades of speculation didn't originate from a conspiracy theorist at all. They came, briefly, directly from the military's own initial public statement, before being walked back almost immediately. This particular pattern, a secretive government facility generating decades of public fascination, isn't unique to the United States either. Other countries maintain their own famously guarded sites. Russia's Mount Yamantau, a vast underground complex whose true purpose has never been officially confirmed, has drawn similar decades of speculation from Western intelligence analysts and the public alike. Throughout the Soviet era, entire closed cities existed on official maps under false names or not at all, home to secret military and research programs. Wherever a government has built something it didn't want observed, it seems curiosity has reliably found its way to the edges of it anyway. The physical facility itself has some concrete, well-documented details worth knowing. Satellite imagery analysis has confirmed the base includes several runways, including one extending, with the adjoining lakebed included, to a length rivaling some of the longest runways anywhere in the world. Well over 10,000 feet, more than enough to accommodate virtually any aircraft ever built. A very real, very large piece of infrastructure, sitting in plain sight from orbit, even while its purposes remain only partially disclosed from the ground. Public interest in this broader subject has its own organized history, too. In 1974, a woman named Coral Lorenzen and others helped establish what would become the National UFO Reporting Center, an organization that has spent decades systematically collecting and cataloging sighting reports submitted by members of the public across the country. It doesn't verify or authenticate any individual report. It simply provides a structured, long-running record of what people say they've seen, a genuine archive of testimony, whatever any of it ultimately turns out to mean. The name Groom Lake itself has nothing to do with any of tonight's mysteries. It's believed to trace back to Augustus Groom, a 19th-century miner who worked the surrounding area for lead and silver long before any government took an interest in the empty lakebed nearby. A perfectly plain, historical name attached, entirely by coincidence, to one of the most mythologized places on the planet. Some names carry no secret at all. They're simply the name of the person who happened to be standing there first. Over the years, a number of former contractors and engineers who once worked at the site have eventually spoken publicly about their time there, once security restrictions and non-disclosure periods finally lifted. Their accounts, taken together, tend to describe something far more ordinary than the legend suggests. Long shifts, routine aircraft testing, standard engineering problems, the everyday texture of a demanding but fundamentally conventional job. It's worth holding this alongside everything else we've discussed. The most consistent insider testimony available doesn't describe anything extraordinary at all. It largely describes exactly what a highly classified aircraft testing facility would actually be like day to day. The site's environmental history includes some genuinely documented, if unglamorous, concerns. Former workers and their families pursued legal action in the 1990s alleging exposure to hazardous waste from the open burning of contaminated materials on site, litigation that became part of what eventually forced greater official acknowledgement of the base's existence, as we touched on earlier. The government has never fully detailed every material involved, citing national security, which has left this particular thread only partially resolved even today. Not evidence of anything extraordinary, but a genuine, unresolved gap in the public record all the same. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, persistent rumors circulated about a secret hypersonic aircraft, sometimes called Aurora, based largely on unusual sonic booms recorded in the region and unusual pulsing contrail patterns some observers nicknamed donuts on a rope. The government has never confirmed any program by that name exists. It remains, even now, one of the more genuinely unresolved threads in this entire story. Not debunked, not confirmed, simply unaccounted for in any official record released so far. A more recent claim, dating to the early 2000s, describes a large, secret, triangular aircraft called the TR-3B, allegedly capable of near-silent flight through some form of exotic propulsion. The claim traces back almost entirely to a single unverified source, a man named Edgar Fouché, and no independent evidence has ever corroborated it. It sits closer to Lazar's account than to the Aurora rumors, a specific named claim, without external verification. There is, separately, a genuinely open category of sightings worth knowing about on its own terms. Since the 1980s, witnesses across many countries have reported large, silent, triangular objects moving slowly through the night sky, a pattern consistent enough that researchers have given it its own informal name, black triangle sightings. Some researchers propose these may be misidentified classified aircraft, possibly connected to programs like the still unconfirmed Aurora rumors. Others argue the pattern doesn't neatly match any known aircraft at all. As of now, no single explanation has been established firmly enough to close the question either way. Much of what has become public knowledge over the decades arrived slowly, through the patient, unglamorous work of journalists and organizations filing repeated Freedom of Information Act requests, sometimes waiting years for a single document to be released, occasionally being denied entirely. The National Security Archive, whose 2013 request finally confirmed the base's name, represents just one example of a much longer, ongoing pattern. Most of this story's genuine progress has come not from dramatic revelation, but from sustained, patient paperwork. One thread from very recent years deserves careful, precise handling. In July of 2023, a former intelligence officer named David Grush testified under oath before Congress, alleging that the government had recovered non-human craft and biological material as part of a long-running secret program. It was a significant, formally documented moment, a real hearing, real sworn testimony. What's equally important to say plainly is what has happened since. The Pentagon's own Office for Investigating These Reports, AARO, conducted a formal review and stated it found no verifiable evidence supporting Grush's specific claims. Grush has continued to be involved in ongoing congressional discussions since, and the broader push for government transparency on this subject has continued right up to the present, including further hearings and, more recently, a presidential directive calling for additional file releases. The claim, the testimony, and the lack of independent corroboration all remain part of the same still unfolding record, exactly as they currently stand. Not far from Groom Lake, another Nevada location called Yucca Mountain became the center of its own decades-long controversy. Proposed for years as the nation's permanent underground repository for nuclear waste, before the project was ultimately shelved amid sustained political and public opposition. It's a reminder that this particular stretch of desert has held more than one deeply contested secret over the years, some involving aircraft and silence, others involving waste and politics, all of it settling into the same quiet, guarded landscape. Some of tonight's questions are already answered. A few of them, honestly, may simply stay open for a good while longer. We're at the halfway point now. Let's slow down even further here and spend some time with the official paperwork itself, the part of this story that rarely makes it into the legend, but quietly holds most of it together. For many decades, the private security firm actually contracted to guard the site's perimeter was a real, named company called Wackenhut, now absorbed into a larger security corporation called G4S. The camo dudes we discussed earlier weren't an anonymous, unaccountable presence. They worked, and in various successor forms may still work, for an entirely ordinary private security business. The same kind of company that guards countless other facilities across the country, simply operating under an unusually strict set of instructions in this particular case. The site's role in testing advanced aircraft didn't end with the Cold War, either. More recent reporting has connected Groom Lake to the development and testing of modern stealth drone technology, including aircraft like the RQ-170 Sentinel, a real, publicly acknowledged reconnaissance drone that gained widespread attention after one was captured, largely intact, by Iranian forces in 2011. The specific role Area 51 played in its development remains only partially detailed publicly, but the broader pattern is a familiar one by now: a new decade, a new classified aircraft, and the same quiet stretch of desert. Long before Area 51 became the center of this story, the U.S. Air Force ran its own official investigations into UFO sightings under a sequence of real, declassified program names. First Project Sign in 1947, then Project Grudge, and finally the far better-known Project Blue Book, which ran from 1952 until 1969. Over more than 2 decades, the program formally investigated over 12,000 reported sightings, eventually concluding that the significant majority had conventional explanations: aircraft, weather phenomena, astronomical objects, and simple misidentification. The program's ending has its own well-documented story. In 1968, the Air Force commissioned an independent study from the University of Colorado, which became known as the Condon Report. Its formal conclusion found no scientific evidence supporting extraterrestrial visitation, and it directly recommended winding down further government-funded UFO investigation. Project Blue Book officially closed the following year, in 1969, not through any dramatic revelation, but through a university report and a government committee simply deciding the program had run its course. It's worth knowing, clearly, about one of the more famous pieces of purported evidence in this entire subject, precisely because it turned out not to hold up. In 1984, a set of documents began circulating, known as the Majestic 12 Papers, describing an alleged secret committee formed in 1947 to manage recovered alien technology and remains. The FBI investigated their authenticity directly and found no evidence they were genuine. Today, the significant majority of UFO researchers themselves, not just official skeptics, regard the documents as a well-constructed hoax. It remains one of the clearest examples in this whole story of a claim that was thoroughly investigated and thoroughly resolved, in a direction that closed the question rather than deepening it. Here's a broader piece of context worth holding on to, since it quietly explains a great deal about why this whole story is set in Nevada specifically. The federal government owns more than 80% of all land within the state, one of the highest percentages of any state in the country. Between the Nevada test site, Nellis Air Force Range, Yucca Mountain, and Area 51 itself, an extraordinary concentration of the nation's most secretive facilities all happen to share the same remote, sparsely populated, federally controlled stretch of desert. Not entirely a coincidence, but a fairly direct consequence of exactly how much of the state the government already owned to begin with. There's a real, technical layer of government secrecy worth understanding, too, beyond the simple idea of classified. Certain especially sensitive programs are designated as special access programs, restricted even beyond ordinary top-secret clearance, and a rarer category still, informally called waived or unacknowledged special access programs, can be kept hidden from oversight bodies that would ordinarily be informed of a program's existence at all. It's a genuine, documented feature of how classification law actually works, and it helps explain something we touched on last time: how even a well-placed intelligence officer, or the head of an agency specifically created to investigate these claims, might still, entirely legitimately, not have access to everything. Following the congressional testimony we discussed last time, Senators Chuck Schumer and Mike Rounds proposed legislation in 2023 known as the UAP Disclosure Act, aiming to establish a formal presumption that government UAP records should be released, along with a review board for any related materials. After extensive negotiation, a significantly narrowed version of the provisions ultimately passed as part of a larger defense spending bill, real documented legislative history, showing this story continuing to move, in small, incremental steps, through the ordinary, unglamorous machinery of government. We're halfway through the mysteries now. 50 more small threads to gather, and no reason at all to rush the second half. Let's step outside the fence itself for a little while now, and look at a few of the wider cases that shape the same broader mystery this whole story belongs to. We mentioned Project Blue Book a little earlier, but the man who led its scientific analysis for years deserves a moment of his own. Astronomer J. Allen Hynek began the program as a committed skeptic, brought in specifically to apply rigorous scientific method to reported sightings. Over more than 2 decades of investigation, his own position gradually shifted, and by the time the program closed, he had become one of the most prominent public voices arguing that a small percentage of cases genuinely resisted conventional explanation. He later coined the now famous term close encounters, and his personal journey, from official skeptic to public advocate for continued study, remains one of the more human threads running through this entire subject. Some of the most well-documented individual cases in this broader field happened far from Nevada entirely, and are worth knowing simply for how differently each one resolved. In 1997, thousands of witnesses across Arizona reported a series of lights moving in formation over the state, an event that came to be known as the Phoenix Lights. The Air Force later attributed much of the sighting to flares dropped during a training exercise at a nearby range. Some witnesses and independent investigators have maintained that explanation doesn't fully account for every detail reported that night, leaving the case formally closed by the government, but not entirely settled in everyone's mind. An even earlier case reaches back to World War II. In February of 1942, anti-aircraft batteries around Los Angeles fired heavily into the night sky at what military personnel believed was an unidentified aircraft, in an event that came to be called the Battle of Los Angeles. A 1983 report from the Office of the Secretary of Defense attributed the incident to wartime nerves following the recent attack on Pearl Harbor, combined with a stray weather balloon and heightened anti-aircraft response. Some historians have continued to debate whether that explanation fully accounts for the number of witnesses and the specifics of what was reported that night. One of the most thoroughly documented cases in the entire field occurred not in America at all, but in England. Over several nights in December of 1980, U.S. Air Force personnel stationed near Rendlesham Forest, close to two operational air bases, reported unexplained lights and an unidentified object in the woods nearby. Because the witnesses were active-duty military personnel who filed official incident reports at the time, rather than civilian accounts gathered after the fact, the Rendlesham Forest incident remains one of the most carefully documented cases available for study, whatever conclusion any individual researcher ultimately draws from it. More recently, a case emerged with a kind of evidence most historical sightings never had. In 2004, Navy pilots flying from the USS Nimitz reported and recorded a radar and video encounter with an unidentified object, nicknamed the Tic Tac for its shape, during training exercises off the California coast. The footage was eventually leaked publicly, and in 2020, the Navy officially confirmed the footage was genuine and unaltered. It remains one of the more credible modern cases specifically because it involves multiple trained military witnesses, corroborating radar data and video evidence, all confirmed authentic by an official body. A meaningfully different category of evidence than most cases we've discussed tonight. The explanation for what the object actually was remains genuinely unresolved. Some proposed conventional explanations point to possible camera or sensor artifacts, or misidentification of a conventional aircraft under unusual viewing conditions. The pilots involved have continued to publicly maintain that the objects observed flight characteristics, including an apparent lack of visible propulsion and extremely rapid acceleration, didn't match any aircraft technology they were aware of. Real data, honestly reported. No settled explanation on either side, at least not yet. A property in rural Utah, commonly known as Skinwalker Ranch, has accumulated decades of reported unusual phenomena from its owners and researchers, and was purchased in 1996 by aerospace entrepreneur Robert Bigelow specifically to study those claims scientifically, through an organization called the National Institute for Discovery Science. The specific paranormal claims associated with the property remain unverified by independent researchers, but the property's ownership history and the genuine scientific interest directed at it are entirely well documented. That same entrepreneur connects directly back to the Pentagon program we discussed a couple of segments ago. Bigelow's aerospace company held legitimate NASA contracts, unrelated to any of this, while he separately and personally funded UFO research through an organization called BASS, which later received funding as part of the same ADIT program eventually confirmed by the New York Times in 2017. Several threads we've walked through across these segments, it turns out, run back through the very same small handful of people and organizations. When official investigators, going back to Project Blue Book's original tally, have reviewed the full body of reported sightings across decades, the overwhelming majority, by most accounts somewhere above 90%, are eventually attributed to conventional explanations. Misidentified planets and stars, whether balloons, satellites, drones, or aircraft catching unusual light at unusual angles. It's worth holding this fact alongside everything else tonight, not to close the door on the remaining unexplained cases, but simply to keep the whole picture honestly in view. A very large majority resolve. A genuine, much smaller handful so far still haven't. Let's come back behind the fence itself for this stretch, closer to the site's own documented history, before we widen out again later. One of the more remarkable declassified programs run from the site wasn't about developing new American aircraft at all, but flying someone else's. Under a program called Constant Peg, declassified in 2006, U.S. pilots secretly flew captured and acquired Soviet-made MiG fighter jets at Nevada ranges associated with the base throughout the 1970s and 80s, learning their true capabilities firsthand in order to train American combat pilots to face them more effectively. For years, encounters with these captured aircraft in restricted airspace likely contributed their own small share to the region's unusual sighting reports. Real foreign aircraft, flown by American pilots, in genuinely restricted skies. That pattern of ordinary military activity generating extraordinary-sounding reports has a much larger, ongoing source nearby, too. Since 1975, nearby Nellis Air Force Base has hosted Red Flag, a series of large-scale, realistic air combat training exercises involving dozens of aircraft performing maneuvers rarely seen in ordinary civilian airspace. It remains, even now, one of the most straightforward, continuously ongoing explanations for unusual aerial activity reported across the region. Not a secret at all, simply an enormous, entirely acknowledged training exercise, happening on a fairly regular schedule. The site's founding purpose connects directly to one of the most significant intelligence incidents of the entire Cold War. In 1960, a U-2 pilot named Gary Powers was shot down while flying a reconnaissance mission over Soviet territory, an aircraft developed and pilots trained at Groom Lake specifically for this kind of mission. The resulting international incident publicly exposed the existence of the broader U-2 program for the first time, though the exact name and location of the facility where it had been developed remained unstated for decades afterward. The very first crack in the secrecy, in other words, came not from a leak or an investigation, but from an aircraft failing in exactly the way its own mission had always risked. A parallel, equally significant Cold War program also drew on the site's expertise. The Corona program, a classified CIA and Air Force reconnaissance satellite effort running from 1959 to 1972, represented America's first operational spy satellite system, and relied on related engineering and testing work connected to the same broader network of facilities. It remains one of the most successful intelligence programs in American history, and like so much of what we've discussed tonight, its very existence wasn't publicly acknowledged until decades after it had already ended. The area's mythology has, over time, built something small and genuinely charming out of all this secrecy. The nearby town of Rachel, Nevada, home to only around 50 permanent residents, has become an unlikely tourism destination, anchored by a real, still-operating motel and restaurant called the Little Ale Inn, its name a playful nod to the very legend that keeps modern visitors passing through. A tiny, ordinary desert town built an entire small economy around a fence most of its visitors will never actually get close to. The land surrounding the base is almost difficult to picture accurately. The broader Nevada Test and Training Range, encompassing Area 51 along with several other facilities, spans well over 2 million acres, making it one of the largest contiguous military training areas in the entire country, larger in total area than several smaller U.S. states combined. An enormous, mostly empty stretch of protected land, built specifically to keep whatever happens within it entirely out of ordinary view. Some researchers have gone looking for harder evidence behind this secret aircraft explains the sightings explanation, rather than simply asserting it. By cross-referencing declassified test flight logs against historical records of regional UFO sighting reports, several independent analyses have found a notable correlation between spikes in reported sightings and known periods of increased classified test flight activity. It's not a perfect one-to-one match for every single report, but it stands as genuine comparative evidence supporting the broader, more mundane explanation, rather than simply an assumption offered without data behind it. There's one more vivid, physical detail worth knowing here. Part of the nearby Nevada test site, an area called Yucca Flat, still bears the visible scars of the underground nuclear testing conducted there for decades. Hundreds of subsidence craters, formed as the ground above each test collapsed inward afterward, clearly visible even now in satellite and aerial photography. A genuinely striking, entirely real landscape, sitting only a short distance from everything else we've discussed tonight. Despite everything declassified since 2013, the name, the general history, the programs we now know by their real code names. The government has never publicly confirmed what specific work is actually being conducted at the site today. Whatever else this whole story resolves into, that particular door, right now, in this exact moment, remains genuinely closed. We mentioned Glenn Campbell's mountain vantage point maps from the 1990s earlier, but his work eventually grew into something larger and longer-lasting. A website called the Dreamland Resort, which for decades has cataloged observations, employee movements, and visible changes at the base reported by enthusiasts and researchers alike, all from entirely public land. It represents a genuinely unusual kind of research archive, built not by any official body, but by ordinary, dedicated citizens simply choosing to keep watching patiently for years at a time. The airspace above the site carries its own official, entirely verifiable designation. It's marked on aviation charts as our 4808N, a restricted zone that civilian aircraft are legally prohibited from entering, enforced not through mystery, but through the same ordinary aviation regulations that govern restricted airspace anywhere else in the country. The secrecy, in this particular respect, is remarkably mundane, a line on a map, and a rule pilots are expected to simply follow. Some proposed connections to the site are considerably harder to substantiate than others. The Strategic Defense Initiative, a real 1980s missile defense research program sometimes nicknamed Star Wars, is occasionally linked to Area 51 in popular speculation. Unlike the U-2, Oxcart, or stealth programs we've discussed, this particular connection rests on considerably thinner documented evidence, and it's worth holding it with more uncertainty than some of tonight's other, more firmly established threads. Much of the modern legend's popular reach owes a great deal to one specific media phenomenon. Beginning in the early 1990s, a nationally syndicated late-night radio program called Coast to Coast AM, hosted for many years by Art Bell, became a major platform for discussing UFOs, government secrecy, and Area 51 specifically, reaching a massive nightly audience across the country. It's worth knowing plainly, an enormous share of how this story reached the wider public came through exactly this kind of late-night radio conversation, rather than through any official government announcement at all. It's worth returning, briefly, to the government's own most direct admission on this subject. The CIA's declassified 2013 internal history, originally written in 1992 by agency historian Gregory Pedlow before its later public release, explicitly credits testing of the U-2 and Oxcart aircraft with generating a majority of UFO reports across Nevada and Utah during the relevant Cold War years. This isn't an outside researcher's theory. It's the agency's own internal historical account, put in writing decades before it was ever meant for public eyes. Even so, declassified rarely means fully complete. A great many of the documents released through Freedom of Information Act requests over the years still arrive heavily redacted, with entire photographs, maps, and passages withheld or blacked out entirely. It's a genuinely documented pattern worth knowing about: partial transparency, released deliberately in careful, incomplete pieces, rather than the kind of single, complete revelation the word declassified might otherwise suggest. The tradition of watching from a distance has simply modernized rather than disappeared. Today, enthusiasts use long-range cameras and occasionally publicly accessible webcams positioned on legal vantage points to continue monitoring visible activity at the base from exactly the same kind of remote perches Glenn Campbell first mapped decades ago. The same quiet, patient practice, simply carried forward with better equipment. The site's cultural footprint has continued to grow well beyond that first wave of 1990s films and television. It has since appeared as the direct subject or setting of video games, further films, and countless documentaries, each new version adding its own small layer onto a legend that, by this point, has been retold by nearly every medium available. Rather than rising or falling in any steady, consistent way over the decades, reported UFO sightings tend to cluster noticeably around periods of major media attention. A new film's release, a notable news story, an anniversary of a famous case, rather than remaining evenly distributed across ordinary, unremarkable nights. It's a genuinely useful piece of context for tonight's entire subject. Public attention, it turns out, doesn't just follow this story. In a real, measurable way, it also seems to help shape exactly when and how often the story gets told at all. We're at the halfway point now. Let's slow down even further here and spend some time with the official paperwork itself, the part of this story that rarely makes it into the legend, but quietly holds most of it together. For many decades, the private security firm actually contracted to guard the site's perimeter was a real, named company called Wackenhut, now absorbed into a larger security corporation called G4S. The camo dudes we discussed earlier weren't an anonymous, unaccountable presence. They worked, and in various successor forms may still work, for an entirely ordinary private security business. The same kind of company that guards countless other facilities across the country, simply operating under an unusually strict set of instructions in this particular case. The site's role in testing advanced aircraft didn't end with the Cold War either. More recent reporting has connected Groom Lake to the development and testing of modern stealth drone technology, including aircraft like the RQ-170 Sentinel, a real, publicly acknowledged reconnaissance drone that gained widespread attention after one was captured, largely intact, by Iranian forces in 2011. The specific role Area 51 played in its development remains only partially detailed publicly, but the broader pattern is a familiar one by now: a new decade, a new classified aircraft, and the same quiet stretch of desert. Let your breathing settle here a moment, unhurried. Whatever is being tested out there tonight, it has nothing to do with you resting exactly where you are. Long before Area 51 became the center of this story, the U.S. Air Force ran its own official investigations into UFO sightings under a sequence of real, declassified program names. First Project Sign in 1947, then Project Grudge, and finally the far better-known Project Blue Book, which ran from 1952 until 1969. Over more than 2 decades, the program formally investigated over 12,000 reported sightings, eventually concluding that the significant majority had conventional explanations: aircraft, weather phenomena, astronomical objects, and simple misidentification. The program's ending has its own well-documented story. In 1968, the Air Force commissioned an independent study from the University of Colorado, which became known as the Condon Report. Its formal conclusion found no scientific evidence supporting extraterrestrial visitation, and it directly recommended winding down further government-funded UFO investigation. Project Blue Book officially closed the following year, in 1969, not through any dramatic revelation, but through a university report and a government committee simply deciding the program had run its course. Beyond all its nicknames, Dreamland, Watertown, the ranch, the facility has also carried a far more ordinary-sounding official designation in Air Force records: Detachment 3 of the Air Force Flight Test Center. It's a small, telling detail. Behind every evocative nickname this place has collected over the decades, there was always, underneath it, an entirely standard piece of military bureaucracy, filed and administered the same plain way as any other detachment in the country. And that plain bureaucracy hasn't entirely stopped, even now. Recent defense appropriations documents and congressional budget records continue to include funding lines using vague, nonspecific language, without naming particular current programs at the site. The very same pattern of careful, deliberate vagueness that shaped this story from its earliest years, simply continuing on, quietly, into the present day. The 2013 declassification that confirmed the base's name also included the release of actual official maps and aerial photographs from government archives, the first time the facility's own layout had been officially shown to the public, rather than pieced together from private satellite imagery or long-range photography taken from outside the fence. It's worth knowing the two are genuinely different things. Enthusiasts had already mapped much of it from a distance for years, but this was the government, for the first time, showing its own official picture. It's worth placing tonight's whole story next to a genuinely different kind of claim, for a moment, simply for contrast. A separate legend, centered on a supposed joint human-alien underground facility beneath Dulce, New Mexico, has circulated for decades in similar circles. Unlike Area 51, this particular claim has never been connected to any declassified document, official acknowledgement, or verified historical record of any kind. Placed side by side, the difference matters. One story, however strange, is built on a genuine, if incomplete, foundation of real government history. The other, so far, isn't built on anything beyond the claims themselves. It's worth knowing, too, just how widely this fascination is actually shared. Public opinion polling over the years, including surveys from organizations like Gallup and Pew, has consistently found that a substantial share of American adults, depending on the exact question asked, often somewhere between a third and half, believe at least some UFO sightings could represent something beyond conventional explanation, or that the government is withholding relevant information. Whatever the underlying truth turns out to be, the curiosity itself is genuinely, measurably widespread, not a fringe position at all. Psychologists who study belief have looked closely at why explanations like these remain so appealing, even in the absence of strong evidence. Some point to a basic, deeply human drive to find patterns and hidden order in a complicated world. Others point to a reasonable, evidence-based distrust of institutions that have at times genuinely kept real secrets, as we discussed earlier with programs like MKUltra. It isn't foolishness. It's a very human response to a very real history of governments occasionally deserving exactly that kind of suspicion. Not every secretive Cold War site has stayed closed forever. Several former nuclear missile silos have since been decommissioned and turned into public museums, and certain other historic test ranges now hold occasional public open house days, allowing ordinary visitors to walk through places that were once every bit as restricted as the fence we've spent tonight walking alongside. It's entirely possible this particular story isn't finished yet either. Simply still waiting, the way so much of tonight's history was, for enough time and enough paperwork to finally pass. Just one gate left to close now, gently, together. There's a real, well-documented pattern worth naming plainly before we go. Researchers who study media and public attention call it the Streisand effect. The way an attempt to suppress or deny a piece of information often draws far more attention to it than simply acknowledging it openly ever would have. Decades of silence, denial, and heavily guarded secrecy around this one small patch of desert didn't quiet the story. If anything, the silence may be the single biggest reason the story grew as large as it did. Whatever else is true, this pattern of quiet, classified spending is very much still ongoing, not merely historical. Public analyses of federal defense spending continue to estimate that tens of billions of dollars flow through classified black budget programs every single year, a genuine, current, entirely acknowledged feature of how the country funds its most sensitive work, exactly as it did when this whole story first began. It's worth marking the simple span of time this whole story covers. The site was established in 1955, which means it has now stood for roughly 70 years, 7 full decades of secrecy, partial disclosure, mythology, and quiet, ongoing work, all happening in the same remote stretch of desert the entire time. And for all that time, all that speculation, all those decades of fascination, it's worth ending honestly, exactly where the evidence actually stands. No independently verified physical evidence of extraterrestrial technology has ever been confirmed at the site by any credible investigation to date. That isn't the end of the story. It's simply plainly where things currently stand. What is confirmed is that the site remains active. Satellite imagery analysts continue to track ongoing construction and visible activity at the base even now. Strong evidence that whatever classified work happens there today, it hasn't stopped, and likely won't anytime soon. If the pattern of the last 70 years holds, more of this particular story will likely keep arriving the exact same way it always has. Slowly, in careful pieces, usually decades after the fact, through patient paperwork rather than sudden revelation. The gate may stay closed for a good while longer. But history suggests it does eventually open a little further, one declassified document at a time. We've reached the end of the walk now, 100 small mysteries gathered gently, some solved, some still genuinely open. You know this fence a little better now than you did 2 hours ago. It's still standing out there in the dark regardless, exactly as it has for 70 years, whether anyone is watching it tonight or not. If you're still here, resting in the dark, there's no need to do anything about that. Just let this last thought settle in beside you. There are other fences like this one. Other quiet, guarded edges of the map, waiting for other nights. Somewhere in the Atlantic, between Florida, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico, ships and aircraft have vanished for generations inside a stretch of ocean sailors simply learned to call the Bermuda Triangle. One night soon, we'll sail into that stretch of water together, carefully, and separate what's genuinely unexplained from what was always just the sea being the sea. Further north, across the wild, empty stretches of Alaska, a similar pattern has quietly repeated itself for decades. Hikers, small planes, and entire hunting parties disappearing into terrain so vast it may simply be the whole explanation on its own. Another night, we'll walk the edge of what's become known as the Alaska Triangle and see how much of it is genuine mystery and how much is simply the honest, ordinary danger of a landscape too large to fully search. And somewhere beyond even that, we'll spend a night with the biggest question of all. Not just this one fence or this one desert, but the far larger, far older question of whether anyone else is out there at all, and what it would actually take scientifically to ever know for certain. You don't have to remember any of that. You don't have to remember this, either, if sleep has already found you. That's all right. That's what tomorrow night is for. Rest well. I'll leave the gate unlocked for next time.